Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1032nd New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the immense pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation with Julianne Swartz and William Corwin. And now it's my honor to introduce our guest and host for the day. Julianne Swartz melds intangible elements, sound, light, air, and magnetism, with traditional craft to create sculpture and immersive installations. Her work beckons participation, inviting individuals to engage deliberately with sensory experiences. Awards include the Foundation for Contemporary Arts Fellowship in Music and Sound, Anonymous Was a Woman Fellowship, and others. Julianne resides and works in Stone Ridge, New York. She teaches at Bard College and serves on the board of governors for the Skowhegan School of Art. And our host today, sculptor and journalist William Corwin, is from New York. He's exhibited at galleries internationally, and he writes regularly for the Brooklyn Rail, Art Papers, Bomb, and other publications. He's the editor of Formalism, collected essays of Saul Ostro, and we are lucky to have him as an editor for the Rail's architecture section. William and Julianne, thank you so much for being here today, and I am so thrilled to pass it over to you, Will, to get us started.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me. I was just saying that, I had the pleasure and the privilege of being in the gallery on an afternoon. The gallery is Bienvenue Steinberg and Jay, where Julianne is having her show on a quiet afternoon, and I was able to sort of soak up, I think, what is part of the intention of much of the work, which is that you are able to experience it and meditate on it, not necessarily, full on staring at it, but just in the background. So as you walk through the gallery, you hear these sort of myriad noises coming from different places, and then you can explore various corners and see where Julianne has sort of put works of art that are not necessarily in sort of traditional plinth or hanging on the wall setup. So it was great to kind of wander into this sort of cabinet of wonders and to experience these odd little noises coming from different directions, and then this sort of symphonic composition of different sounds that are meant to alert you to different parts of the work, and then to see the work moving back and forth. And so I think part of what today will be is to talk about the composition of that space and that experience that you have with the work, not necessarily visually, but also in an auditory way, and even just in a kind of auratic way, knowing it's there, and kind of like walking through a forest and hearing noises and then wondering what's making that noise. So I think, without further ado, if we could take a quick look at the video of the work, that would be a great way to start to get people familiarized. So I believe that piece is called T-score shaking tables. And that's sort of in the back of the gallery space. Um, and I was immediately fascinated by this intersection between the technological and the organic that seems to be a recurring theme in many of the works in the show. Particularly the little sort of vibrating chrysalis shapes and their kind of nest objects, or whatever you would call them, their nest armatures. But also with this kind of aesthetic, there is a very obvious digital relay or setup which controls the movement. So there is you don't make any attempt to hide the mechanism that sort of makes these things move. So I wanted to ask you first to talk about this intersection between this organic and mechanistic, this aesthetic that you have.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you, Will, and thanks everyone for being here. Well, the mechanistic, what you're calling the mechanistic, is not actually a machine. It's actually these things are responding to influences of force fields. So it's the reason they're moving is because sound is moving through the objects. So the players are not like they're not Arduino or anything, they're audio players. So they're just playing a score of sound that moves through the objects. So actually the mechanistic is also based in vibration. So it's also acoustic, which I think, also has a relationship to organic. But the forms, the organic forms, everything I make, like kind of not everything, but I'm really drawn to organic forms that speak to the body, that speak to and from our body and bodies of other living things. Those tables, the forms in those tables and other things in the exhibition, they're like creatures, and they kind of elicit care, I guess, these forms. So the mechanistic is, what you're calling mechanistic. I rarely, in fact, almost never use motors, but I try to find other ways to get my sculptures to animate and to have life. So the what you're calling the mechanistic is the kind of the force of life through them. But the impetus is really the animation of the materials rather than a machine. So I'm trying to make something that has a life rather than something that is mechanized.
And how do you sort of compose these movements then? Do you in the studio, do you have sort of a setup where you alternate the vibrations to see which ones move faster or slower? Is it more of a sort of a random incidental thing where they move based on the sound that you are producing or the vibrations that you're producing? How intense is this sort of back and forth to create this experience?
Well, these T-scores, so they're called T-scores, which stands for Tenderness scores, and I made them knowing that they would conduct a score of sounds through their bodies, through their material. And I wasn't exactly sure. Some of them kind of came to life knowing what the sounds would be, and some of them I kind of had to find the sounds after the object was made. But I compose a score of sounds, yes, by a lot of trying sounds through them and seeing what the vibration does, what the vibration makes them do.
And when did you start on that road of using vibrations as a mechanism in your artistic practice?
Well, this body of work, the Tenderness scores, is kind of a second iteration of a body of work I did in 2016 called Bone Scores. And in 2016, I realized, well, I kind of, I've been working with sound for a very long time, and acoustics and electricity and magnetism, and how sound vibration, basically the energy of sound vibration. And I realized in 2016 that the way a speaker is made is with, like, it's just this very simple system of a wire coil and a magnet and some kind of surface. And the sound going through the speaker is activated by the magnet and then resounds on the surface. So I kind of took apart that mechanism and started to make sculptures that were essentially speakers, but they're, you know, so they're all different materials, but they always include a magnet and a coil, a live coil. And then sometimes they include a surface that can conduct the sound, and sometimes they only conduct, you know, they don't conduct anything with orality, they just conduct the vibration. But essentially what these are deconstructed or reconstructed functioning speakers. So it's been, you know, about 8 years that I've been working with that system and kind of refining and defining how these materials, you know, how magnets read the vibrations from the coils. I know that's kind of technical. I can explain more if you want, but that's the basic gist of how those work and how long I've been working with that system.
No, I mean, I guess just the inevitable question is then, do you have a musical background? Is this something that this intersection of the visceral and the resonant and then sound, is this something that, you know, you've been, you know, like, do you play an instrument? Are you making music? I'm always curious if there's sort of a root there.
I don't have an academic musical background, and I have no official musical background. I cannot read music. I cannot play any instruments, but I'm very sonically attuned and sound sensitive, and always have been super sound sensitive. So I think that I came to sound through its ephemerality, actually, through its physical presence. Well, I would say through its presence without physicality. And my first sound works, I mean, I started doing sound works in 2003, and those were pop songs moving through tubes, moving through buildings, you know, like kind of funneled sound through buildings, through tubes. So I came to sound actually through light, I think, through making work first with light and fiber optics. And the way that fiber optics work is through taking light in one end, and the light bounces around a really, really thin mirrored tube and comes out the other end a little bit different. Like it's a way of transporting this ephemeral thing through this tube. So then I, you know, remembered doing that as a kid with the like vacuum cleaner tubes and stuff like that, and tried doing this with tubes, and then pushed it and pushed it and pushed it further and further and further, until I was, you know, just making these systems of moving sound physically. So that's when I started getting interested in sound, but it wasn't really through the music or through the, yeah, it wasn't through the music part of it. It was through the material part of it, or like the immaterial part of it.
Well, in terms of ephemerality, that was sort of one of the next questions on my mind. Walking through the space, there are the tenderness score tables, shaking tables, and then there are these sort of gossamer pieces that there's one that sort of hangs down and shakes. There's two in the corners that are kind of these very, very delicate twine and metal circular kind of coils or interlocking circles. I don't know what you would characterize them as, but the whole idea of tenderness and softness and fragility exists in these works. So a piece like Corner Zero, which is one of those pieces that you have in the corner, which just seems to almost be placed there. So it kind of rejects this idea of sculpture as having weight or having being positioned, but instead sort of just hanging or resting or floating. And so one thing that does is that it has tremendous ephemerality, but on the other hand, as a viewer, if you move quickly or you breathe, they move and they reference what you're doing. So there is this fragility. So I'm curious. We talked about where the fragility begins to emerge in your work with this idea of sound and opticality, but also just this rejection of monumentalism in sculpture. How has that emerged in your practice? The fragility.
Well, I'm just always have been really interested in what's almost not there, and the fragility. I don't know. For me, something that's very, very fragile is is moving, is something that I care about, and I tend to care personally often more about what is fragile than what is really, you know, in my face, solid, you know, coming at me. I think that, you know, what I make in the studio, I make to hone my own attention and my own patience. And, you know, I make things that I need to care about. And I think that there's a really potent tension between what is, you know, what's almost imperceptible, and then attention, paying attention, finding attention. A question that I, you know, have asked myself from the beginning with my practice is, what can I make that ask people to walk more gently in the world? You know, could I make something that brings someone in and focused and attentive, and you know, and then they leave with that degree of attention and possibly that degree of gentleness moving out of the space where they have encountered my work. I think, well, actually, do you want me to, maybe I could just explain to you the Corner Zero piece. Eleanor, could we look at the blue one? Do you have a picture of the two blue? Yeah, this one. So what this is two stainless steel wires, and parts of the wires have been painted, you know, very, very thin stainless steel wire, 30 gauge, and part of them have been painted with a really bright blue paint, and they hover in a corner. They're just adhering there with through the magnetism of their material. So they, you know, the steel adheres to the magnet. So it's a stainless steel, which doesn't adhere as well as carbon steel, but they're so light that there's enough magnetism there. I put magnets in the wall and they're, you know, they're spackled and painted over so you don't see them. But there's enough magnetism there to hold the weight of that thing, which is almost nothing. You're right, it's almost nothing. And yes, if you breathe, they respond. So that kind of, and you know, a lot of people go into that show and don't see that piece because it's over there in the corner and, you know, the lines are very, very slight. But if you do see that piece, if you find it, then there's something there that's yours. Like, to me, there's something in the finding of a work. If you discover it and you know, it didn't warn you, but then it's right there in front of you. That's a real relationship to that thing. And you know, I'm interested in that kind of relationship with a viewer that is an encounter, like maybe a more intimate kind of encounter than if you prepare. I could talk a lot more about, you know, tenderness and impermanence. I could talk all day about those things, but you know, you can ask me more about that if you want, but I have definitely more to say on those things.
Well, I think it's interesting, this idea of fragility and tenderness, and yes, I think you should talk more about that. I think, but I'm curious in a technical way. You know, you think about an artist like Sam Gilliam who does hanging canvas pieces, and you would never say, "Oh, that's kinetic," but your pieces, because they're so light, because they move. Do you consider something like Corner Zero to be a kinetic work of art? And then, what is, you know, going back to tenderness, what is your relationship to kinetic work? Is it's almost like a psychic kinetic work where the presence of a person energizes the work, not just not a motor, as you said. There's no motor, it's sound. So I'm curious what we're feeling. Would you call your works kinetic?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's a very perceptive comment to say that this corner 02 blue is kinetic, because it is, because it is in a force field. It's in the magnetic force field, and that's why it has form. You know, that's why it keeps its form. And you know, that is a kineticism that we're not necessarily attuned to, because it is a vibration. Magnetism, you know, you could say, is a force field, is that a vibration? You know, it's a very, very fine sense of flux, right? A very, very fine influx situation. But I think that rather than call these works kinetic, I call them like active, I guess. Like they're in an active state. I have other magnetic works that kind of hover towards a wall. I have a piece called Lean that is leaning towards a wall, but doesn't touch the wall because it's being pulled up by a magnet in the wall. And the magnet isn't repelling it. The magnet is pulling it up so that it has almost no weight, so that it is, you know, leaning and kind of struggling to get near the wall. So that it looks still, but it's not still. It's, you know, in an active state.
And then with Corner Zero, I mean, how did you make this piece? Did you do a drawing? Did you coil the wires and sort of come to a moment where you felt like it embodied what you were looking for? What was its origin?
Well, corner zero, I've done magnet work for a long time. And the first works I did with magnets were with thread, and and then I did the heavy steel magnet works, like the heavier steel, like the lean that I just explained. But the corner zeros, I just had, I I just kind of got very interested in the ring. I mean, I'm always interested in circles, circles as portals, circles as zeros. And I don't know, I just like had this idea of reducing those magnet works that I've been doing for many years, but reducing them to their most, what could be the least amount of material, what could be the least thing that would still, still have this relationship of being held in like this force field. And so these wires, they're really, really thin capillary tubing in stainless steel and steel. And, they were just sort of the least thing I could get that would still have the magnetism, that would still respond to magnetism. And they make, I don't know, zeros and corners. It makes sense to me right now. It makes sense. And there's different ones. This is one, and there's another one in the show called Reverse Arc. That's, quite different. It's a thicker, we could look at that picture if you want, Eleanor. This is a thicker tube. And because it's thicker and it has more weight, I have to put a steel wire through it. Otherwise, it won't adhere. It won't carry its own weight on the magnets in the wall. But if you go closer, is that yeah, you can see that there's coming out of the tube, there's 7 wires that are much thinner that carry color. And so they make this reverse rainbow, or the reverse arc. And there's other works in that series, the Corner Zero series, but there weren't, there was only a couple corners to activate in that gallery.
Mm-hmm. And there's also that whole idea of the depiction of the universe as the circle within the square. So that's sort of what emerged to me was that kind of the totality of both there. It's sort of like an ideogram right there, 3-dimensionally. I was not too long ago in the Yves Tanguy museum, and the thing that strikes you when you're there is the clanging and the banging and the noise, and this sort of obsession. One could say kind of masculine obsession with showing the motors and how they move. And I thought that there was sort of a wonderful, contrast in your show with the little blinking lights on the LEDs of the sort of the digital setup that was maintaining the resonance and the sound. But I thought it was interesting that you're not trying to hide that either, which I wanted to talk more about. That is the sort of the person behind the curtain operating it. There's in at least this T-score tables, there is not this insistence on that this is a magical thing that is happening, hiding, and just magically occurring. There is a very specific causation that is making these things vibrate. And first of all, I'm curious what you think about Tanguy and his work, and then also how you feel about this idea of either exposing the inner workings of a kind of mystical project, or trying to hide it and make it seem like it just comes out of nowhere. What is because you do hide the magnets in the corner pieces, so they do kind of float, which is interesting. But
Well, the reason the magnets are hidden in the corner pieces is so you can see the form of the circle. And if the magnets were there, they would interrupt that. So I make it very clear in the materials list. It's really important for me that the materials are clear about what's there. In general, I do not like to hide the mechanism. But the mechanism is often, the mechanism is kind of curious and complicated, and so it is often missed, but I try to make it available. Because I would like those two things to happen simultaneously, the magic and the understanding that the magic is really easy or everyday. So that's why I like to, show the mechanism if I can. It comes back. I've been working with audio for a long time, and, I just stopped trying to hide cables at a certain point, mostly, stop hiding wires, stop hiding cables. Just, this is the mechanism that it needs. So let's be clear about what it needs. So in general, I don't need the secret to be how it works, but sometimes I like the secret to be the piece. I definitely am interested in mystery, but I think that the pieces, because the mechanisms are very untraditional, have that mystery. So you can have the mystery and also the clarity if you want to go into it and kind of figure it out. Oh, and Jean Tingley, those works are very important works, and I always, teach them in my Sculpture 1 class. They're important works. They're not at all the kind of works that I'm aiming to make. They're in a way the opposite of the kind of works that I want to make. I mean, I really am interested in quiet sound for the most part. I mean, sometimes I'm making immersive sonic environments that are not quiet. But if they're not quiet, they will always have quiet. If they're not always quiet, there's always moments of quiet. But like shaking tables can get really loud and really aggressive. Like they really shake sometimes, all those tables, and they're insistent, and then they stop, and then they quiet down, and that pause is really, really important to me. Was there more of that question I didn't answer?
No, but I think it's very interesting that you say you're going for the opposite of Tangley. Tangley then is kind of disruptive and not punitive, but it's trying to kind of get into it's trying to force itself into your experience, whereas one would argue that yours is sort of drawing the viewer in, as opposed to, or the listener in, as opposed to sort of hitting them over the head with a noise. Would you say that's true, do you think?
Hopefully, yes. Yeah. I mean, there's we could look at another, like this sound work, if you want, the shell, T-score shell, which is hanging there. Eleanor, do you want to show that? Oh, you're going to the video. Actually, you could even show show the video first, and then we could look at the image. So before you show this video, let me just say that this is hanging in the room, and it's kind of moving with the air, and it is making sound but you don't necessarily know it. I mean, once in a while it will emit a kind of louder utterance, but to know that it's making sound, you have to be quite close to it. But yeah, why don't we play that one? So that you know, you really have to find that and get, you know, kind of get really close to that object before you receive its sound. And I'll just also say that the sound from that is quite different from the sound in the in shaking tables and legs, which are the other two, you know, pieces that you can hear in the show. And the sound, I took the sound from projects I did in 2008 and 2010, where I asked people to, I used to do a lot of projects where I would have participants lend kind of personal sound to my pieces. So in these were recordings where I asked people, you know, I put them alone in a recording booth, and the prompt was to comfort a frightened child was one of the prompts, and the other prompt was to whisper into someone's ear that you feel tenderness for. So there were two, you know, completely different projects, but I took parts of those recordings, and that's what goes through Shell. And actually, Chloe, can you go back to the picture of Shell so I can explain how it works? Because
I was gonna ask you what that was, how it works. Yeah.
I love how this works. I love it. See that thing on the top that looks like a bunny ears is a wire coil holding a magnet, and there's sound going through that. And then the sound is just transferred through that wire into that beautiful resonant surface. It's so resonant. That paper nest is so resonant. So it, you know, gets a really particular quality of those voices, because it's taking out a lot of frequencies. You know, it doesn't reproduce like a regular speaker would. So it has, you know, this very particular filtering through the paper. Do you understand how that works? Does that make sense?
I think so. What I thought was intriguing also was that you have sort of a variety of technology. So there's the LEDs and the sort of circuit boards. Then there are these sort of metal boxes that are on top at the ceiling, and then there are what you just described, which is this sort of little ball, which seems to be surrounded by some kind of sort of fuzz or very, very, very thin wire in a very, very tight sort of netting around it. And I was staring at that, saying, like, this must have a purpose. This is not an aesthetic gesture. But what I thought was interesting was that practicality, that sort of organic practicality, also emerges in a couple of the pieces where you have the empty web, the emptiness weave, which I don't think makes a sound. It's more of just a piece like the corner circles that just sort of floats back and forth. But I was fascinated by that aesthetic of the sort of organic of the cell and the chitinous surface of a bug or something like that. So where are you drawing your inspiration for a lot of this, the kind of the carefully layered paper in the sort of nests for the T-score tables, or the emptiness weave? Where is that coming from? Is that a fascination with natural structures? Is that just kind of bred out of slowly kind of meticulously weaving things together? What is the process for that?
Well, I could talk about the emptiness weaves. Eleanor, do you want to show a picture of one of those? The one, emptiness weave lost grid, is that on there? I would also, there, like, very, very little of my decisions are aesthetic, actually. Most of them are functional. So when you said, yeah, that thing can't just be aesthetic, that has to have a function. Well, 90% of the time, yeah, it does. The emptiness weaves, you can't really get a sense of the fiber here, because I think this picture, in order to see it, the photographer kind of filled in some of the lines a bit, is to tell the truth, because I have tried to take pictures of these for 2 years and they are impossible to photograph. But they're the thinnest copper filaments, thinner than hair. And I make these with my amazing assistant, Caitlin, who has much better eyes than me. And, like, it's so delicate to be able to form that, to give that really, really thin filament form. So we start with a grid, and then the grid, you can see on the top that it's kind of a grid structure. And then, the weight of the material, it just like deforms, really, because it's not really a material that can hold a grid that well. And so then the grid becomes these voids, and and the voids become then pictorial, I guess. They become a representation of a space, of the grid that's not there. But they're really formed in part through this struggle of, like, trying to give this sort of impossible material form. And these, yeah, you can see that in the picture, but it got, it was walked into twice. The first, the first day that the piece was, there was another one in the show that got destroyed, actually. So from someone walking into it. So I ended up having to put a piece of plexiglass under this. But the great thing is that you know, you don't see it, but then when you do see it, there it is, you know, it like materializes in front of you. So that's why I'm very interested in this material and in this form of making a weaving with like just the thinnest filament.
And how long have you been making the emptiness weaves? Is this a long, have you been
I started in 2020
Hmm.
and they've changed kind of form and name. In 2020, when I was watching a lot of TV with my daughter, and you know, really wondering what in the world to make, what needs to be made, you know, like what's going on. All I could really do in the studio was make I had this really thin, you know, I have a lot of wires here, and I had this black wire that's, you know, hair thin, and I would just sit in front of the TV and make zeros with it, like circles, zeros, different sizes. And then I start to put those together, and I ended up making a very large piece called Zero Blanket, and it took about 2 years to make. And um, and that was like the first of these, what I'm calling now emptiness weaves.
And you seem to love this idea of people not necessarily knowing that the art is there. There, when you go into the gallery, there, you know, you can obviously pick up the checklist, you can look, but there aren't, as you said, you had to put down a plexiglass rectangle underneath emptiness weave so that people would know it was there. And you do, there's this process of discovery, walking through the space. And in terms of, you know, as we discussed before, the NSE began, this idea of an immersive experience. I mean, you already at Bienvenue Steinberg and Jay, there is this kind of, it's almost immersive. So what for you is the sort of transition point behind between an exhibition and an immersive exhibition? So what does immersive mean if it's not going to be what we've got in Tenderness?
Tenderness is definitely not, I wouldn't call this an immersive exhibition, but this is an exhibition of distinct objects, and objects that do have some relationship to one another, but they were not made to be one thing. They're, you know, they're objects with separate identities. And in an immersive, you know, I've made a lot of immersive installations that are all like one, you know, one place, one thing, even though that one thing might have multiple components. So I guess that would really be the difference. And you know, something that I'm working on now is an immersive installation with sound frequencies that do that, you know, that have I've been studying sound frequency healing and you know, it's sort of the physiological effect of certain sound frequencies. And actually, Will, you mentioned in like something you wrote earlier, you mentioned to me about the tone that you heard going through the gallery.
Yeah.
And that is actually one of these, that's 3 frequencies, and they play through the tables. And those 3 frequencies are they're frequencies that have the intention of putting the brain in a meditative state and opening the like the third eye and the crown chakra. So that's what, you know, that's what pierces the room once in a while at Bienvenue. Steinberg, but I am working on an immersive installation that is where the frequencies are more dominant, to kind of like that's the material in the room.
And does that have a sculptural component, or is it purely auditory?
I don't know exactly, because I think that, multisensory is really important to me. So I'm experimenting with air, actually, with air on the skin, which isn't necessarily a visual component, but it is a tactile component.
Hmm.
So, yeah, kind of that's in process, but.
Well, I don't want to not talk about the spectrum works. They do seem to be a different body of work. And I don't know if we can put up some of the pictures, but there are a series of milled planks along the wall leaning. So they have a wonderful sort of gravity feel that they're not installed, but they're obviously placed. But they are very, very rectilinear as opposed to diaphanous. And then they, exude this kind of rainbow in the shadow is a rainbow. And I thought it was interesting because these forms are very rectilinear. There is no means of knowing how the rainbow of the spectrum is produced. It just kind of emerges from the wood. And so, the first thing that I was thinking is like, so what is this relationship between this rectilinear orthographic object and then this sort of diaphanous spectrum that's coming from it? So I don't know, can you speak about those pieces?
Could we show the side view of the spectrum? Yeah, there you go. These pieces were, yeah, let me say that the wood is a way to make the projection. So, the wood is rectilinear and very solid, and I love that contrast. And but the wood is the means to the projection, and the projection is made from ambient light. So they harvest light. These pieces harvest the light in the room, and actually, in my studio, I love them with the lights out. Because they harvest the light in the room, and it glows, and that's just from the reflection of the light from behind they're painted behind the other side of the board is painted, and then the light reflects from that. And I had to do a lot of work. We did a lot of work figuring out the type of paint, the mixture of paint. Most of this has 32 colors on it. This projected spectrum comes from 32 bands of color, and some of the color is horizontal and some of it is vertical on the board behind. And that's, and many of those colors we mixed, and some of them are out of the jar, but a lot of them are mixed. And it took a long time to figure out how to do this, but it's super simple, and it's all in the back, and you can't really understand how. But then, the materials are there, so you can figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and I'll also say that spectrum it starts at the ground with red and ends at the top with a purple color. And that is actually the reverse of a rainbow spectrum, because a rainbow spectrum will always, the arc will always have the red on top. And this is, I'm basing this on the, like the spinal chakra spectrum. So starting with the base chakra as red and then ending with the purple at the crown. So I also think, they're like, in some ways, like bodies too. They're all sort of, kind of body scale.
On a technically and just conceptually, when did you make these? Were these are in your studio when you're working? Are you making spectrum pieces simultaneously with T-score table pieces, or do you have to kind of be in a mindset of this is going to be light, now I'm going to work with sound? I'm not going to do those at the same time. I'm just curious.
No, I have to do them at the same time. I have to work on a lot of things that are really different at the same time, because I get very frustrated and have to move to the, like the T scores are the most really very frustrating kind of work to work on. Those tables, have fallen over so many hundreds of times, and I have to be able to like switch my brain to another form. So I really always have needed to be working on different kinds of work at the same time in my studio.
Cool, wonderful. Well, I think I've been noticing we have a lot of questions coming in, so I think we should open up the conversation to our viewers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Will and Julianne. This has been a really brilliant conversation. There's so much to think about here. You have such a special, unique, and beautiful practice, Julianne. So thank you for sharing some of it with us. We do have some great questions from the audience today. So our first question will be from GE. GE, you can unmute.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, William, as always. And thank you, Julianne. This is so exciting and so nourishing on different levels. My question is, you seem to have made objects to appeal, to really appeal to our need for an experience of the somatic, as perhaps like an antidote to this overly digital oceanic world that we're immersed in. And it seems as though there's kind of a restoration at work here. Is there anything to this?
Yes, I love how you framed that as a restoration. The somatic is definitely my entry point, and my personally, for me, that is where I can be my most present, like when in a somatic experience. And so restoration is such a good, beautiful word. And, I feel like we're taken, the mind. I mean, it's not only digital processes, it's not only the world that we live in, it's not only our news cycle, it's not, it's not only those things, it's the mind, it's the human condition of being, always drawn away from the now and from the somatic experience of right now, and of being in this body. The body is the site of this life, and we are always taken from it.
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Julianne. Thanks, GE, for that question as well. Our next question is from Dulce, and I will allow you to unmute.
Hi, Julianne.
Hi, Dulce. Hi.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the that one of the questions that you always find yourself asking to your work is that you would like it to bring someone to work with more attention and gentleness. I just wanted to know if you could share what other questions you ask to your work. And then my second question would be, if like what inspires you, or how do you get yourself to start a new body of work? Like as an emerging artist, I find myself sometimes like having a lot of ideas, but maybe not enough time to work on my practice, and then like how to like choose which ones to follow, or I don't know. I just wanted to know like how, if you could talk a bit about your creative process, especially at the beginning of something new.
Thank you for that question, Dulce. Well, other questions I ask. How do I make vulnerability okay? Like, how do I, in this world that is very brutal, like what's the opposite of brutality is a question I ask. And that's where I think tenderness comes in. So, tenderness is not, tenderness is care for sure, but tenderness is also feeling tender. Like, tenderness is also a place of woundedness. So I think that, how can woundedness be honored and, like, how can it be given strength in a way, or given power? So that's another question I ask. And well, really, that's really about a kind of transference of, how can how can it be a gift, really? How can woundedness be a gift for presence, for somatic experience, that kind of thing? Okay, so that's something I ask. Also, you asked how I get, like, how do I, my impetus, or how do I get started? They'll say, tell me the second part of your question.
I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, I guess what, like like your creative process, and especially the beginning of when you're starting something new, like maybe you already have like, I don't know, like a discipline and ongoing things that are like lead to another, but like, yeah, just I'm curious about the process before starting to actually do something. Like, what are, like, where do you gather like ideas or inspiration, or how do you decide which idea to pursue, like that part of your practice, rather than when you're already doing something? Is that clear?
Well, sometimes it's from the world, something I see, hear, experience. A lot of times it's a translation of feeling, maybe like a specific emotion. Shaking tables is a translation of anxiety, really, of like some very specific feelings of relentless kind of anxiety. So sometimes it's translation of emotion. A lot of times sculptures come from an image. Like I had the image of the planks of the spectrum pieces. Just like usually in the morning, I wake up with an image sometimes in the morning, and like a picture in my head. And a lot of work also just comes from the development of a process, like working with this process of the speaker making of the coils and magnets, and, making a body of work of those in 2016, and then coming back to that process and building on it. So sometimes it's just like building on what I have learned.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for those really thoughtful questions, Dulce, and thank you, Julianne, for those beautiful answers. Our next question today will be from David. David, I will allow you to unmute if you'd like. If not, I can ask for you.
Hi, sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just wondering, kind of following the previous question, but who do you rely on in your practice? Who have you relied on over the years in the creative world, be they architects or poets or other visual artists or soundscaping people?
Thank you for that question, David. I have taken a lot of inspiration from sound artists. Pauline Oliveros and Marianne Amiche were both my teachers in graduate school at Bard. And, I draw on their their contributions often. And there's a Brazilian artist named Fernanda Gomes that has been making work for a long time, maybe 30 years. And I very much appreciate her, the quietness and the intensity of her practice. And, my constant has been my mom, who is an artist. And, when I was a teenager, she was like burying paintings and doing rituals at sacred sites, and has always really inspired me. Actually, when I was a teenager, I was not as inspired as I am now. When I was a teenager, it was more complicated. But yes, she's been a huge inspiration.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Julianne. Thank you so much as well, David, for that question. Our final question today is going to be from Fong. Fong, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Julianne. Congratulations on the show. I will come to see it as soon as I put the April issue to bed. Thank you. Thank you also, Will, for this marvelous conversation. Just yesterday, we have the artist Guadalupe Maravilla came and spoke about his work in relation to folklore, a lot of aspects of healing, which everything he could really accumulate as a kind of total pictorial arsenal in a way to mediate between being where he came from Latin American culture, and being here, the sense of displacement and everything was very profound. And I know that you are friend with many of our poets friends and writers friend in common, Michael Towsett, the great anthropologist, and then David Levi Strauss and Gret Smith and other people. So somehow the natural question for me to ask is, I feel there's in your work, in addition to what you have shared with Will already, there's aspects of semantic, healing in a way. There's certain kind of hidden sense of hermeticism. And I really appreciate G.A. mentioned the word restoration, because hermeticism, after all, is an act of recovery of the image in some way, and then if that can thicken into the shamanic, practice, shamanism or healing, itself is not always associated with magic. Instead, it's a transformative power, I would say, or certain means to shed emotional trauma as we know it, or blockages or burden, all kind of baggages that keep us from being the best version of ourselves. So I felt there's a very poetic quietness hidden below the work. But that is my observation. You think that's fairly true in some way?
Thank you so much for that observation, Fong. Actually, in college, in undergraduate, I studied poetry. And before, I mean, I took art classes. I took a few art classes as a kind of pressure release in college, but I really didn't, my poetry was my focus. And so yes, your observation is very correct, that coming from that kind of poetic standpoint is, that is a starting point, I think, for many works. Yeah, and the healing also, that is something also that my mother made a healing, an environment that was a healing art installation in 1983, which was not a great time to do that, but she did it. And I always, thinking about art as a restoration or as a way to, some in some kind of healing capacity that may not be like specifically overt, but that it's there. Like that's always been a kind of permission for me to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of what makes me feel comfortable to do it, actually. That purpose.
Yeah. Well, there's very discrete poetry embedded in each work differently. So can't wait to see the show. Thank you so much. Congratulations again. And yeah, back to you, Eleanor.
Thank you so much, Vaughn. That was such a great observation. Really great question. Huge thanks again, Julianne, for answering all of our questions today and for sharing so generously about your work. And thank you so much, Will, for your great questions. It's been a really, really special and fantastic dialogue today. And before we conclude, I'm so excited to pass it back over to Julianne for a reading.
Yes, Chloe suggested that I choose a poem for the end of the reading, and I did. I chose a poem from Joy Harjo, who was my teacher actually at University of Arizona in 1989. So I'm going to read this poem, and it is called "This Morning I Pray for My Enemies." This morning I pray for my enemies. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing, even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend.
So beautiful, Julianne. Thank you so much for reading that. Really, really perfect way to conclude today. Thank you again, both of you, Julianne and Will, for the amazing conversation today. Thank you also to Adriana from Bienvenue Steinberg and Jay for helping us to prepare for this event.
Yay.
So I'd like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the NSE and for supporting our archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted very soon. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through a link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Archipelago Books translators Tess Lewis, Mira Rosenthal, and Richard Seaberth, hosted by Cole Svensson. Huge thanks to everyone again for being here today. And you can now turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
So
Thank you
excited.
so much.
Thank you so much.
Conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Julianne.
Julianne. Great
Thank you,
poem.
Thank you,
Julianne.
Julianne.
Wonderful,
reading.
Thank you,
incredible
Julianne.
conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
much today.
you,
Thank
Cal.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Go see the
everyone.
show, everybody.
Thank you.
Go see the show.
Please, congratulations again.
Bye.
And
Thank you.
goodbye. Thanks everyone.
Have a great
Thank
afternoon.
you.
Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.